It starts with the cold, metallic click of handcuffs, a successful law-abiding man standing on his own front porch, humiliated in front of his neighbors while two arrogant cops smirk, convinced they've just caught a brazen burglar. But they didn't bother to verify the address. They didn't bother to check his ID. And when the chief of police hears the suspect's name over the radio, he doesn't just drive to the scene. He speeds there in a blind, cold sweat panic, because these two officers didn't just arrest an innocent man. They handcuffed the one person who held the power to dismantle their entire department. The evening of October 14th began like any other crisp autumn twilight in the affluent, meticulously manicured neighborhood of Crestwood Hills, Illinois. The streets were lined with towering oak trees, and the driveways boasted imported luxury sedans. It was the kind of neighborhood where people paid a premium for silence, security, and predictability. David Carmichael loved the quiet. At 48, David had spent the last 2 decades building a formidable career in law and public service. He was a man who commanded respect in courtrooms and boardrooms alike. Tall, with broad shoulders and graying temples that gave him a distinguished air, David had just moved into 442 Oakwood Drive 3 days prior. The boxes were barely unpacked inside the sprawling 4-bedroom colonial. That evening, David had stepped outside in a cashmere sweater and tailored slacks to retrieve a package left at the edge of his property. The problem occurred when he turned around to go back inside. The state-of-the-art smart lock on his custom mahogany front door had malfunctioned. A blinking red light mocked him as he tapped his passcode. The mechanism was jammed. Frustrated, David sighed, setting the package down on the porch. He pulled a small flathead screwdriver from his pocket, a habit from his days fixing up old cars in his youth, and crouched by the door, gently attempting to pry the battery casing loose to reset the system. It was a minor inconvenience, something that would take him 3 minutes to fix. He didn't notice the twitching curtains across the street. Cynthia Gable, a 60-something neighborhood watch captain with far too much time on her hands and an ingrained sense of suspicion, was watching him through her high-end binoculars. Cynthia had lived in Crestwood Hills for 20 years and prided herself on knowing who belonged in her neighborhood. She hadn't seen the moving trucks arrive over the weekend while she was out of town. All she saw now was a tall black man in dark clothing, crouching by the front door of the supposedly vacant Henderson property, picking the lock. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her smartphone and dialed 911. "Yes, police? I need to report a break-in in progress," Cynthia whispered into the receiver, her voice trembling with manufactured adrenaline. 4420 Oakwood Drive. There is a man trying to break into the house. Yes, he's at the front door right now with a tool. You need to hurry before he gets inside. Less than 2 miles away, Patrol Car 47 was finishing a routine traffic stop. Inside were Officer Gary Higgins and Officer Todd Miller. Higgins was a 5-year veteran of the force, a man whose aggressive arrogance often compensated for his deep-seated insecurities. Miller was younger, only 10 months out of the academy, and desperate to earn Higgins's approval. When the dispatch call crackled over the radio, "Suspect in progress, possible burglary, 4420 Oakwood Drive," Higgins slammed his foot on the gas. "Finally some real action," Higgins muttered, the siren wailing as they tore through the quiet suburban streets. "Burglary in Crestwood? This guy is stupid." Back on the porch, David had just managed to pop the casing off the smart lock. He removed the batteries, waited 10 seconds, and popped them back in. A satisfying green light illuminated the keypad. He smiled, standing up and dusting off his knees. He reached for the handle. Suddenly, the blinding glare of a police spotlight washed over him, casting harsh, elongated shadows against the brick facade of his home. The screech of tires echoed through the quiet street as the cruiser hopped the curb, stopping aggressively at the end of his driveway. "Step away from the door. Hands where I can see them! Now!" The voice, booming through the PA system, was deafening. David turned, shielding his eyes from the intense glare. He saw two silhouettes stepping out of the cruiser. Their hands were resting menacingly on the butts of their holstered firearms. David's pulse spiked, but his decades of legal training instantly kicked in. He knew the statistics. He knew how quickly a misunderstanding could turn fatal. He took a slow, deliberate breath, keeping his movements smooth and telegraphed. "Good evening, officers," David said, his voice calm, resonant, and steady. He raised his hands to chest level, palms open and facing forward. "There's no problem here. I'm just fixing my lock." "I said step away from the door," Higgins barked, unholstering his taser and advancing up the walkway. Miller flanked him, hand still on his sidearm, looking nervous. "Get down the stairs. Do it now!" "Officers, I am the homeowner," David replied, taking one slow step down to comply. "My name is David Carmichael. I live here. My ID is in my back right pocket." Higgins scoffed, a nasty, cynical sound. "Yeah, right. Homeowner. Down on the ground. Interlace your fingers behind your head." David stopped on the bottom step of his porch. His calm demeanor remained, but his eyes hardened. "Officer, I am complying with your orders, but I will not lie in the dirt of my own front yard. I have identified myself. I have offered you my identification. I suggest you take a moment to de-escalate and verify my residence." "You don't give the orders here, pal," Higgins sneered, closing the distance. He grabbed David's left arm with violent force, yanking him off balance. The physical contact was entirely unjustified. David stumbled forward but caught himself, his heavy frame refusing to be easily manhandled. This resistance, though entirely passive, triggered something dark and aggressive in Higgins. "Stop resisting!" Higgins yelled, the universal scripted battle cry of an officer looking for an excuse to escalate. "I am not resisting," David said firmly, though his heart was now hammering against his ribs. "You are assaulting me on my own property." Miller rushed in, grabbing David's other arm. Together the two officers shoved the 48-year-old man face first against the hood of David's own car, a brand-new, charcoal-grey Mercedes-Benz S-Class, parked in the driveway. The impact knocked the wind out of David. The cold metal of the car bit into his cheek. Neighbors were beginning to emerge from their homes. Porch lights flicked on like a wave up and down Oakwood Drive. Cynthia Gable stood at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, watching with a satisfied smirk as the police handled the threat. Other neighbors, people David hadn't even had the chance to introduce himself to yet, were pulling out their phones to record the spectacle. "Legs apart!" Higgins commanded, kicking David's ankles to force his legs wide. He dug his knee into David's lower back, pressing him painfully against the hood of the Mercedes. "Check his pockets, Miller," Higgins ordered, breathing heavily. "See what he stole." "I stole nothing," David said, his voice slightly muffled against the car, but still eerily composed. "My wallet is in my back right pocket. My driver's license will show this address. The keys to this vehicle, which I am currently pressed against, are in my left pocket." Miller hesitated, reaching into David's back pocket and pulling out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open. The young officer squinted in the dim light. Higgins? His ID says David Carmichael. The address matches." Higgins didn't let up the pressure on David's spine. "It's a fake, or he stole the wallet from the homeowner and is using it to cover his tracks. You think I'm stupid? Guys like this don't live in houses like this." David closed his eyes. The sheer, unadulterated ignorance of the statement hung in the crisp autumn air. Guys like this. The implication was crystal clear. With a brutal yank, Higgins pulled David's arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around David's wrists. They were ratcheted tight. Too tight, biting instantly into the skin. "You're under arrest for attempted burglary, trespassing, and resisting arrest," Higgins said, leaning down so his hot breath ghosted across David's ear. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." They hauled David upright. He stood there, handcuffed in his own driveway, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the cruiser. He looked around at the small crowd of neighbors. Some looked concerned, others looked validated. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. But beneath the humiliation, a cold, calculated fury was taking root. David looked directly at Officer Higgins. The officer was grinning, proud of his collar. "Officer," David said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling authority that made Miller flinch. "I'm going to give you one chance. Look at the ID again. Run my name through your dispatch system. You have exactly 3 minutes to take these handcuffs off me, apologize, and leave my property. If you do not, I promise you, by tomorrow morning, you will no longer have a career in law enforcement." Higgins laughed out loud. It was a loud, abrasive sound that echoed down the street. "Oh, I'm shaking. What are you gonna do, sue me? Get in line, buddy. I've dealt with 100 loudmouths like you. You're going to a holding cell." "I am not a loudmouth," David said softly, his eyes boring into Higgins. "I am a man who understands exactly how the system works. And you, officer, have just made a catastrophic error." "Get him in the back of the car," Higgins told Miller, ignoring David's warning completely. Miller grabbed David by the bicep and escorted him toward the cruiser. Before putting him in, Miller pressed the button on his shoulder radio to call it in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. We have one in custody at 4420 Oakwood Drive. Suspect is secured. Requesting a transport van." "Copy 47. The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Can I get a name on the suspect?" Higgins grabbed his own radio. "Yeah, dispatch. Suspect is claiming the name David Carmichael. Probably an alias. We're bringing him in for processing." There was a pause on the radio. A long, heavy silence that stretched for 5, 10, 15 seconds. Then the dispatcher's voice came back, sounding noticeably tense. "Unit 47, please repeat the suspect's name." "David Carmichael," Higgins said, rolling his eyes. "Carmichael. What's the hold-up, Brenda? Just log it." Another long pause. "Unit 47, hold your position. Do not transport. The chief is getting on the radio." Higgins frowned, exchanging a confused look with Miller. "The chief? What the hell does Chief Callahan care about a burglary suspect?" 10 miles away, in the dim, wood-paneled corner booth of O'Malley's Diner, Chief of Police Robert Bob Callahan was nursing a black coffee and a raging headache. Callahan had been the chief of the Crestwood Hills Police Department for 7 years. Lately, his job had been a nightmare. The state government had recently cracked down on municipal police departments, launching sweeping investigations into civil rights violations, excessive force, and municipal corruption. Crestwood Hills was squarely in the crosshairs. Just last week, the governor had appointed a new, highly feared special prosecutor, a man with absolute federal and state authority, to audit local departments and bring down the hammer on systemic misconduct. Callahan had been sweating bullets. He knew his department wasn't clean. He knew he had officers, like Gary Higgins, who were walking liabilities. Callahan had been explicitly warned that the new special prosecutor was relocating to the area to begin a deep-dive investigation into Crestwood Hills. The mandate was clear: one screw-up, one high-profile mistake, and the state would take over the department, fire the command staff, and strip them of their pensions. The radio clipped to Callahan's belt squawked. He usually ignored standard dispatch traffic while on dinner break, letting the watch commander handle it. But the address caught his ear. One in custody, at 4420 Oakwood Drive. Callahan frowned, setting his coffee mug down. He knew that address. The mayor had personally called him 2 days ago to inform him that the city had quietly arranged high-end residential security for a VIP moving into that exact property. It was a corporate lease paid for by the state attorney general's office. Callahan grabbed his radio, listening intently as Higgins's voice came through. Suspect is claiming the name David Carmichael. The blood drained from Chief Callahan's face. His stomach bottomed out, plummeting into his shoes. A cold, icy dread seized his chest, squeezing his heart until he thought he might pass out. David Carmichael, the newly appointed special prosecutor, the man holding the keys to the entire department's future, the man who had taken down corrupt police forces in 3 different major cities. And his idiot patrolman had him in handcuffs. Callahan didn't even bother to key his mic at first. He scrambled out of the booth, throwing a $20 bill onto the table, and sprinted out the door of the diner. He practically threw himself into his unmarked SUV, slamming the door and firing up the engine. He keyed his radio with a trembling hand as he flipped on his emergency lights and sirens, tearing out of the parking lot so fast the tires smoked. "Unit 47, this is Chief Callahan," he barked into the radio, his voice cracking with raw panic. "Do not move. Do not put that man in the vehicle. Do not speak to him. If you have a hand on him, take it off right now. I am 5 minutes out. You hold your goddamn position." Back at Oakwood Drive, Higgins stared at his radio in utter shock. "The chief," Miller whispered, his face going pale. "Why is the chief screaming?" I don't know," Higgins stammered, his arrogant bravado instantly evaporating. He looked from the radio to David, who was still standing by the cruiser, hands cuffed behind his back. David offered Higgins a cold, humorless smile. "I believe your 3 minutes are up, officer." "Shut up!" Higgins snapped, though his voice lacked its previous venom. Doubt was creeping in, insidious and terrifying. He looked at the wallet in Miller's hand. He snatched it, looking closely at the driver's license. The picture matched. The address matched. He pulled out a shiny silver card tucked behind the license. It was a State of Illinois credentials card. David A. Carmichael, Special Prosecutor, Office of the Attorney General. Higgins felt his knees go weak. The color vanished from his cheeks. He looked up at David, his jaw hanging open. You're... "I told you who I was," David said softly, the flashing lights reflecting in his steady, unblinking eyes, "and I told you what was going to happen." For the next 4 minutes, the street was agonizingly silent, save for the idling engine of the police cruiser. The neighbors continued to watch, confused by the sudden standstill. Higgins and Miller stood frozen, terrified to move, terrified to speak, terrified to even look at the man they had just assaulted. Higgins's hand hovered over the handcuff keys on his belt, but the chief's orders had been absolute. Do not move. Do not touch him. Then, the wail of a siren pierced the night. It grew louder, faster, more frantic than a standard police response. A black Ford Explorer with hidden strobes blazing tore around the corner of Oakwood Drive. It didn't brake gracefully. It slammed to a halt at a harsh angle, half on the grass, right behind the patrol car. The door flew open before the vehicle was even fully in park. Chief Bob Callahan practically fell out of the SUV. He was breathless, his tie askew, his face a mottled, terrifying shade of crimson. He sprinted up the driveway, completely ignoring his 2 officers, and stopped directly in front of David Carmichael. Callahan looked at the handcuffs, biting into David's wrists. He looked at the dirt on David's cashmere sweater. He looked at the red mark on David's cheek where Higgins had slammed him against the Mercedes. Callahan closed his eyes, letting out a ragged, shaking breath. He knew with absolute certainty that his career and the reputation of his entire department had just ended. "Mr. Carmichael," Chief Callahan whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound apology and sheer terror. "Sir, my God, I am so sorry." The silence on Oakwood Drive was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the police cruiser's engine and the frantic, shallow breathing of Officer Gary Higgins. Chief Bob Callahan stood frozen on the concrete walkway, his eyes locked on the heavy steel cuffs binding David Carmichael's wrists. The sheer gravity of the situation was crushing him. Callahan was a veteran cop who had navigated political minefields for a decade, but looking at the special prosecutor bleeding slightly onto his own driveway, he knew there was no spinning this. This was a catastrophic failure. Callahan turned his head slowly. The look he gave Officer Higgins possessed a lethal intensity. It was the look of a man watching his pension, his reputation, and his legacy burn to ash. "The keys!" Callahan demanded, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that carried more menace than any scream. "Give me the keys right now." Higgins's hands were shaking so violently he could barely operate his own duty belt. He fumbled with the leather pouch, dropping the small metal key onto the driveway. The clink against the concrete sounded like a gunshot in the quiet neighborhood. He scrambled to pick it up, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the crisp autumn air. "Chief, we got a call," Higgins stammered, his arrogant swagger entirely replaced by the pathetic whimper of a man realizing his life was over. Dispatch said burglary in progress. He was at the door. "Shut your mouth," Callahan snarled, snatching the key from Higgins's trembling fingers. He shoved the patrolman aside with enough force to make Higgins stumble, then stepped cautiously behind David. "Mr. Carmichael, sir, I am taking these off," Callahan said, his hands visibly shaking as he inserted the key. Click, click. The steel jaws released. David brought his arms forward slowly, wincing as blood flowed back into his hands. Deep, angry red indentations circled his wrists. He rubbed them methodically, turning around to face the 3 police officers standing in his driveway. "Chief Callahan," David said. His voice was not raised. It was perfectly level, devoid of any shouting or histrionics. And yet, it cut through the night air like a scalpel. "I assume you are aware of who I am." "Yes, sir." "I am," Callahan replied, swallowing hard. "And I cannot begin to express how profoundly sorry I am for this catastrophic misunderstanding." "It was not a misunderstanding," David corrected him, adjusting the cuffs of his cashmere sweater. "A misunderstanding is a misread address. A misunderstanding is a polite inquiry. What happened here was a blatant, aggressive violation of my Fourth Amendment rights. A Terry stop executed without reasonable, articulable suspicion, followed immediately by excessive force, false imprisonment, and battery." David took a step forward. Higgins instinctively took a step back, hiding behind the chief. "I identified myself immediately," David continued, his eyes drilling into Higgins. "I informed your officer of my address. I offered my identification. In response, I was assaulted, slammed against my own vehicle, and mocked." Before Callahan could formulate an apology, a high-pitched, self-righteous voice broke through the tension. "Well, it's about time someone did something about the crime in this area." From the edge of the property line, Cynthia Gable was marching up the driveway. She wore a quilted floral robe and a triumphant smile, clutching her smartphone to her chest like a medal of honor. She had seen the chief arrive and assumed he was there to congratulate the patrolman on a major bust. "I'm the one who called 911, Chief," Cynthia announced proudly, stopping a few feet away. She glared at David, then looked expectantly at the officers. I saw him picking the lock. I knew he didn't belong here. Good job, boys. We have to keep our neighborhood safe. Chief Callahan looked at the woman, his eyes widening in pure disbelief. He opened his mouth to yell at her, to tell her to get back in her house before she made things infinitely worse. But David raised a single hand, stopping the chief in his tracks. David turned to the neighbor. He offered her a polite, terrifyingly calm smile. "Good evening, ma'am," David said smoothly. "I am David Carmichael. I purchased this property 3 weeks ago. I moved in on Tuesday." Cynthia's triumphant smile faltered. She blinked, looking from David to the police cruiser, then to the chief, who looked as though he was going to be physically sick. That's impossible," Cynthia stammered. "The Hendersons moved out. I didn't see moving trucks. My relocation was handled privately, due to the sensitive nature of my employment with the state of Illinois," David replied, taking a step toward her. The sheer authority radiating from him made Cynthia shrink back. "And you are the one who initiated the emergency response?" I thought you were a burglar," she squeaked, her bravado evaporating. "Because I was fixing a jammed smart lock on my own front door?" David asked, his tone inquisitive, but heavily laced with legal peril. "Or because I am a black man standing in Crestwood Hills?" "That has nothing to do with it," Cynthia gasped, clutching her pearls in a gesture so cliché it almost made David laugh. "It has everything to do with it," David said, his voice dropping to a frigid whisper. "You bypassed a non-emergency inquiry and escalated directly to a 911 dispatch, providing false information of a crime in progress. Your reckless assumption just facilitated a gross civil rights violation." David turned his attention back to Chief Callahan, pointing a long finger at Cynthia. "Chief, please ensure this woman's information is recorded. I will be subpoenaing the 911 dispatch audio tomorrow morning. She is now a material witness in a federal civil rights inquiry, and I intend to explore civil litigation against her for initiating a false police report that resulted in my physical injury." Cynthia let out a sharp, panicked gasp. "Civil litigation? You can't sue me! I was protecting the neighborhood!" "You will be hearing from my attorneys by the end of the week. I suggest you retain counsel," David said dismissively, turning his back on her completely. Cynthia stood frozen for a second before spinning around and speed-walking back to her house in a state of absolute terror. David looked at the 2 patrol officers. Miller looked like he was going to cry. Higgins looked like a man standing on the gallows, waiting for the trap door to open. "Officers," David said, "get off my property." Higgins didn't need to be told twice. He turned, grabbing Miller's sleeve, and hurried toward the patrol car. "Not you, Chief," David said softly, as Callahan began to turn. Callahan froze. "You and I," David said, gesturing toward the open front door of his home, where the smart lock now glowed a welcoming, serene green, "are going to step inside. We have a great deal to discuss." The interior of 4420 Oakwood Drive was a stark contrast to the violence and chaos that had just unfolded on the driveway. It was impeccably designed, minimalist, elegant, with dark hardwood floors, vaulted ceilings, and abstract art hanging on the pristine white walls. The scent of expensive cedar and fresh paint lingered in the air. Chief Callahan stood awkwardly in the grand foyer, feeling distinctly out of place in his rumpled uniform. He watched as David Carmichael walked over to a wet bar, tucked into an alcove, poured himself a glass of sparkling water, and took a long, deliberate sip. David did not offer the chief a drink. He did not ask him to sit. "Mr. Carmichael," Callahan began, desperate to seize control of the narrative before the silence suffocated him entirely. "I want to assure you, personally, that Officer Higgins will be suspended, without pay, effective immediately. By tomorrow morning, I will have his badge on my desk. He will be terminated. Officer Miller will face severe disciplinary action and retraining. I will personally oversee. Stop talking, Chief, David interrupted, his tone conversational but absolute. Callahan snapped his mouth shut. David walked over to a sleek, glass-topped dining table and rested his hands on it, leaning forward slightly. The ambient light from the chandelier cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the bruise forming on his left cheekbone. "Do you think I care about Gary Higgins?" David asked, tilting his head. "Do you think firing one arrogant, hot-headed patrolman solves the problem?" Callahan swallowed hard. "Sir, it was an isolated incident of poor judgment. Do not insult my intelligence," David snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "I have spent the last 3 months reviewing the internal data of the Crestwood Hills Police Department. I was dispatched by the Attorney General because your department's use of force complaints have spiked by 42% in 3 years. Your traffic stop disparities are statistically indefensible, and your Internal Affairs Division clears 98% of all civilian complaints without disciplinary action." David took a step closer to the chief. "Higgins is not an anomaly, Bob. He is the culture. A culture you cultivated. A culture you protected. He felt entirely comfortable assaulting a man who was completely compliant, completely passive, and who had already provided identification. Why? Because he knew you wouldn't punish him. Because he's done it before, hasn't he?" Callahan's silence was a deafening confirmation. "I moved here quietly," David continued, pacing slowly around the edge of the dining table like a predator circling its prey. "I wanted to observe your department from the ground up before I initiated my formal audit. I wanted to see how this city operates when it thinks nobody is watching. Well, I got my answer on day 3. "Mr. Carmichael, please," Callahan pleaded, his hands sweating. "If you take this public, if the AG uses this to justify a federal consent decree, it will destroy the city. The mayor will gut the department. Morale will collapse." "Morale?" David laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You're worried about the morale of men who slam innocent homeowners against cars? Let me tell you what is going to happen, Chief." David reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times and placed it face up on the glass table. "That is a draft of the preliminary injunction I was preparing to file next month," David said, pointing to the glowing screen. "But tonight, you gave me a gift. A horrible, painful, humiliating gift. You gave me undeniable, first-hand, irrefutable evidence of systematic constitutional violations." The chief stared at the phone as if it were a live grenade. "But here is the twist, Chief Callahan," David said, leaning in close. "I don't just want a consent decree. Consent decrees take years. They get bogged down in bureaucratic red tape. I want immediate, structural decapitation of your toxic command staff. And I have the leverage to get it." David's eyes locked onto Callahan's. "I know about the Miller-Hastings audit." Callahan physically recoiled. The color vanished from his face so rapidly he looked sickly pale. The Miller-Hastings audit was a highly classified internal review conducted 2 years ago regarding the disappearance of $40,000 from the department's evidence locker, money tied to a local narcotics ring. The audit had implicated 2 senior captains, both of whom were Callahan's closest friends. Callahan had buried the report to save his command staff, citing inconclusive findings. How could you possibly know about that?" Callahan whispered, his voice trembling. "I am the special prosecutor," David reminded him coldly. "I don't knock on the front door. I come through the floorboards. I was going to use the audit to force your resignation in a few months. But after what your boys did to me tonight, the timeline just accelerated." David picked up his water glass and took another sip, letting the chief twist in the wind of his own impending destruction. "Here is your ultimatum, Bob. Non-negotiable," David stated, ticking the points off on his fingers. 1. Higgins is terminated tomorrow morning. Not suspended pending investigation. Terminated. I will personally file the criminal battery charges against him with the district attorney. You will not protect him." Callahan nodded numbly. "2," David continued. "You will mandate the immediate implementation of the Civilian Oversight Board the mayor has been begging for, and you will grant them full subpoena power over your Internal Affairs Division." "The union will strike," Callahan protested weakly. "Let them," David countered instantly. "Because if they do, point 3 goes into effect. Tomorrow at noon, I will hold a press conference on my front lawn. I will release the body cam footage of my assault. I will release the 911 audio. I will release the findings of your racially biased traffic stops. And I will release the unredacted Miller-Hastings audit, detailing how you, Chief Callahan, covered up felony theft by your own captains." Callahan grabbed the edge of the glass table to steady himself. His chest heaved. He was trapped in a perfect, inescapable checkmate. If he fought David, he would be indicted and ruined publicly. If he complied, he would have to betray his union and his friends, tearing down the very power structure he had spent his life building. "You're dismantling my department," Callahan said, his voice hollow. "I am performing a necessary amputation to save the patient," David corrected him. "You built a department that operates on arrogance and impunity. Tonight, you found out what happens when that impunity collides with someone who has the power to fight back. Most people Higgins slams against a hood don't have a badge shinier than his. I do." David walked over to the front door and opened it. The cold night air rushed into the foyer. The police cruiser was still parked at the end of the driveway, its lights mercifully turned off. But Higgins and Miller were still standing by the doors, waiting for their chief. "You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow to issue the termination papers and sign the oversight agreement," David said, holding the door open. "If my phone does not ring by 9:01 a.m., I call the press, and I call the FBI." Callahan walked slowly toward the door. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the span of 20 minutes. He stopped in the threshold and looked at David Carmichael. "I thought I was a good cop, Mr. Carmichael," Callahan whispered, a hint of genuine despair in his voice. "Somewhere along the line, I just wanted to protect my guys." "Your job was to protect the public," David said softly, his tone devoid of sympathy. "You forgot the difference. Good night, Chief." David closed the heavy mahogany door. The smart lock clicked, flashing a secure green. Outside, Chief Callahan walked slowly down the driveway. Higgins stepped forward, his face tight with frantic hope. "Chief?" Higgins asked, his voice cracking. "What did he say? Are we okay?" Callahan stopped. He looked at Higgins, the hot-headed patrolman who had just burned down his entire world. Callahan felt a surge of rage, but it wasn't just directed at Higgins. It was directed at himself. "Give me your badge, Gary," Callahan said, his voice dead and empty. "And your weapon. You're done." The neon clock on the wall of the precinct bullpen buzzed with a low, agonizing hum. It was 6:15 a.m. on Wednesday. The squad room was mostly empty, smelling of stale coffee, ozone, and old floor wax. Inside Chief Bob Callahan's glass-walled office, the air was suffocatingly thick. 4 men stood around Callahan's heavy oak desk. Officer Gary Higgins, stripped of his duty belt, but still wearing his uniform, was pacing like a caged animal. Beside him stood Thomas Sullivan, the heavy-set, red-faced president of the local Police Benevolent Association. Leaning against the filing cabinet with his arms crossed was Captain Arthur Reynolds, one of the 2 senior officers heavily implicated in the buried Miller-Hastings evidence locker scandal. Callahan had just finished explaining the ultimatum David Carmichael had laid out. He watched the varying degrees of panic and rage wash over the 3 men. "You've got to be kidding me, Bob," Sullivan spat, slamming a meaty fist onto the desk. "You're going to let some suit from the Attorney General's office come into our town, dictate our personnel, and mandate a civilian oversight board. Over a bruised wrist and a hurt ego? Absolutely not. The union will walk out by noon." "It's not just a bruised wrist, Tommy," Callahan fired back, his eyes bloodshot from a completely sleepless night. "It's false arrest, battery, and a massive civil rights violation on the special prosecutor sent here specifically to look for an excuse to gut us. He has the body cam footage. He has the 911 audio." "So what?" Higgins sneered, stopping his pacing to glare at the chief. "The guy got aggressive. He resisted. I used standard compliance techniques. The neighbor called it in as a burglary. We acted on good faith. Any judge in the county will throw out his little civil suit." "He doesn't need a county judge, Gary," Callahan groaned, rubbing his temples. "He has the FBI on speed dial. And he's not just threatening you. He's threatening all of us. He knows about the Miller-Hastings audit." Captain Reynolds, who had been perfectly silent until that moment, suddenly stood up straight, the color draining from his face. He knows about the 40 grand? "He knows everything, Artie," Callahan said softly. "He told me he'll release the unredacted audit to the press at noon today, if I don't fire Higgins and sign the oversight agreement. If he does that, you and Captain Greer are looking at federal indictments for theft. And I'm looking at 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for conspiracy and obstruction of justice." The room plunged into a chilling silence. The bravado evaporated from Sullivan's face. He looked at Captain Reynolds, then at Callahan, suddenly realizing that this wasn't about a union grievance. This was about survival. But Gary Higgins wasn't going to go down quietly. The narcissism that made him a terror on the streets now made him a cornered rat in the precinct. "No," Higgins said, his voice trembling with a dark, venomous rage. "No, I am not being the sacrificial lamb for your dirty money, Chief." "Gary, it's over," Callahan pleaded. "I'll make sure the union gets you a quiet severance package. But you have to turn in your resignation." "Screw your severance package," Higgins shouted, stepping right up to the chief's desk. "You think you can just burn me to save your own skin? Let me tell you how this is going to go. 2 years ago, when you buried that audit, you and Captain Reynolds had a lovely little conversation in Squad Car 12 about how you were going to alter the evidence logs. You thought the dash cam audio was off. It wasn't. I was the one who checked the car back into the motor pool. I pulled the memory card. I've had it in a safe deposit box ever since." Callahan froze. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. Captain Reynolds physically stumbled backward, hitting the filing cabinet. You recorded us?" Reynolds stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "I took an insurance policy." Higgins smiled, a sick, desperate grin stretching across his face. "So here is my ultimatum, Chief. You don't fire me. You tell this Carmichael guy to go to hell. If he releases his audit, I release the audio of you and Reynolds committing a felony. If I go down, I am taking the entire command staff with me. Do we understand each other?" Higgins didn't wait for an answer. He turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the glass door so hard it rattled in its frame. Inside the office, Sullivan let out a long, low whistle. "Well, Bob, looks like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place." Callahan sank into his leather chair. It was 7:30 a.m. He had 90 minutes before David Carmichael tore his department to pieces, and now his own patrolman was holding a loaded gun to his head. The chief looked at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. The empire of corruption and protection he had spent a decade building was collapsing inward, crushing him under its weight. At 8:45 a.m., David Carmichael sat in the sunlit breakfast nook of his new home, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. A steaming cup of Earl Grey tea sat on the table beside a stack of crisp, legal documents. His tablet was propped up, streaming the local morning news. His phone buzzed. It was a Google alert for his own name. David tapped the notification. It linked to the Crestwood Daily Tribune's breaking news blog. The headline read, "Exclusive, anonymous police source. Claims incoming state prosecutor. Used political clout to avoid arrest. Threatens local cops." David read the article with a serene, terrifyingly calm expression. The article, clearly fed to a friendly reporter by Gary Higgins, painted a wild narrative. It claimed that police had responded to a legitimate burglary call, and that the suspect, Carmichael, had become violently uncooperative, verbally abused the officers, and then used his state connections to blackmail the chief of police into dropping the charges and forcing a good cop off the force. David set the phone down and took a slow sip of his tea. He wasn't angry. He was deeply, profoundly satisfied. He had known Gary Higgins was a narcissist. He had profiled the man's disciplinary file for weeks. Narcissists never accept defeat. They always try to control the narrative. David had banked on Higgins doing something incredibly stupid, and the patrolman had just handed David the final nail for the department's coffin. At exactly 8:58 a.m., a black SUV pulled into David's driveway. Through the window, David watched Chief Callahan walk up the path. The chief looked like a dead man walking. His shoulders were slumped, his face ashen. David opened the front door before Callahan could even knock. "Mr. Carmichael," Callahan rasped, holding out a manila folder. His hand was trembling. "Here it is. Higgins's termination papers, signed, and the mayoral agreement for the Civilian Oversight Board, with full subpoena power, signed by me and the union president. We met your demands." David looked at the folder, but he didn't take it. Instead, he held up his tablet, showing the chief the headline from the Tribune. Callahan squinted at the screen. As he read the words, the last remnants of hope drained from his eyes. No, I didn't authorize this. Gary went rogue. Your demands were simple, Bob," David said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "Fire the officer, sign the agreement, and we handle this quietly. But your man couldn't keep his mouth shut. He tried to smear my name in the press to save his own skin." "Please," Callahan begged, tears actually forming in the corners of his eyes. "I gave you what you wanted. Higgins has dashcam audio of me, of a mistake I made years ago. He blackmailed me this morning. I pushed his termination through anyway. I fell on my sword for you." "You didn't fall on your sword for me," David corrected him sharply. "You did it because you were out of options. But the deal was absolute compliance and silence. Higgins broke the silence, which means the deal is void." "What are you going to do?" Callahan whispered. "What I came to this city to do," David replied. "I suggest you go back to your precinct and call a lawyer. A very good one." David closed the door in the chief's face. At noon that day, the front lawn of 4420 Oakwood Drive was transformed. News vans from every major network in Chicago and the surrounding suburbs had descended upon the quiet, affluent neighborhood. Microphones were clustered on a podium set up in the driveway. Neighbors, including a horrified and deeply embarrassed Cynthia Gable, watched from their porches as state troopers secured the perimeter. At 12:05 p.m., David Carmichael stepped up to the podium. The cameras flashed, a sea of bright lights reflecting off his immaculate suit. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his resonant voice commanding absolute silence from the press corps. "3 days ago, I moved into this neighborhood to begin my tenure as the special prosecutor for the state attorney general. Last night, while attempting to fix a broken lock on my own front door, I was racially profiled, falsely accused, and brutally assaulted by officers of the Crestwood Hills Police Department." A murmur rippled through the reporters. "However," David continued, his eyes scanning the cameras, This press conference is not about me. What happened to me is merely a symptom of a malignant disease rotting the core of this city's law enforcement. David signaled to a state technician standing by a large monitor. The screen flickered to life, playing the body cam footage of Gary Higgins slamming David against the Mercedes. The audio of the 911 call played simultaneously, Cynthia Gable's frantic, baseless accusations ringing out for the entire world to hear. The reporters gasped. It was undeniable, visceral proof. Officer Gary Higgins, the man in that video, attempted to leak a false narrative to the press this morning, claiming I was the aggressor, David announced, holding up a stack of documents. But Officer Higgins is the least of this city's problems, because the corruption does not end on the streets. It goes all the way to the chief's office. David held up the thick, bound copy of the Miller-Hastings audit. This is an internal audit, buried 2 years ago, by Chief Robert Callahan. It details the systemic theft of over $40,000 from the narcotics evidence locker, orchestrated by Captain Arthur Reynolds and other members of the command staff. Chief Callahan concealed this felony to protect his friends. The press corps erupted into a frenzy of shouted questions. "Effective immediately," David stated, raising his voice over the chaos. "I am filing federal civil rights and criminal battery charges against Gary Higgins. I am officially handing the Miller-Hastings audit over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I am filing an emergency petition with the state Supreme Court to place the Crestwood Hills Police Department under immediate federal receivership." As David spoke, the cameras caught a flurry of movement down the street. 3 black FBI Suburbans were rolling slowly toward the precinct downtown. "No one is above the law," David concluded, looking directly into the main broadcast camera, a promise etched into his unyielding expression. "Especially not those who wear a badge to enforce it. Thank you." By 3 p.m., Chief Bob Callahan and Captain Reynolds were walked out of the precinct in handcuffs by federal agents. By 4 p.m., Gary Higgins was arrested at his home, crying as the metal cuffs snapped around his wrists, a sharp, ironic echo of the pain he had inflicted the night before. And by evening, as the sun set over Crestwood Hills, the neighborhood was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. Cynthia Gable's curtains remained firmly drawn, her reign of paranoid terror permanently shattered. The residents who had watched the abuse in silence now realized that accountability had finally moved in next door. David Carmichael sat on his porch, watching the twilight settle. The smart lock glowed a peaceful green. The battle for the city had just begun, but the first strike was a flawless, devastating victory. He took a sip of his tea, finally enjoying the quiet. The abuse of power thrives in the dark, relying on silence and fear to protect those who wear the badge as a shield for their own ego. But as this story proves, true authority doesn't come from a uniform or a pair of handcuffs. It comes from the relentless, uncompromising pursuit of justice. David Carmichael turned his darkest moment into a masterclass on dismantling a corrupt system from the inside out. If this story of accountability and triumph had your heart pounding, don't keep it to yourself.